Tonight, Darby still the star of the show, but weakening now in the Central Pacific. And now the latest around the wide world of tropics. Tropical Weather Bulletin for July 15th. Right now we still have the sole tropical cyclone around the world, which remains pretty dormant at this time. Some might be surprised by that. And it's Darby that's still keeping up the interest for anyone around the world right now. A category 2, although it is weakening now quite substantially as it heads towards Hawaii. Day 45 of Atlantic hurricane season, and we still have nothing on the radar over the next 5 days. No areas of interest whatsoever. We've had 3 storms so far. It's been a little while since we had that last one, so we still wait on in the Atlantic. Day 62 in the Eastern Pacific, and Darby there in the Central Pacific now, and a 90% chance for an area of interest which is likely to become our next tropical cyclone moving out to sea, and will probably become another hurricane. A weak one though, shouldn't be as strong as Darby, although that one did surprise us. Western Pacific, also nothing active and nothing expected in the next 5 days. No signs of life after those 2 failed invests last week. So still we wait on for our next tropical cyclone. And in the Indian Ocean we still have that one area of interest, 10%, that actually makes itself known now. You can see it on satellite imagery, we'll look at it in a moment, but still a very small chance of forming in marginal conditions. Well then, let's take a look at our satellite imagery then across the Atlantic right now, and this is how it looks. You can see a little low pressure system along the Bahamas there, and along the coast of Florida, quite a lot of convection blowing up there, but generally a quiet picture across the Atlantic, dry air dominating in the Caribbean and out over the main development region. Eastern Pacific, you can quite clearly see that invest there on the right hand side. Rotation needs to improve, but it will get there eventually. It's a rather broad system. You see it's twice the size of Darby, which is on the left hand side there, fighting against all that dry air on its own as it gets towards the Hawaiian Islands. And here's a close-up of Darby right now. I say close-up, it still looks fairly small, and that's because it really is. It has been small throughout its entire life really, and as you can see it's lost its eye. That happened earlier today, and now it looks as though maybe it's even getting sheared a little bit towards the north there, with the southern side possibly on its way to becoming exposed. We'll wait and see whether that happens. Convection still blowing up, but by the looks of things it is shriveling up very quickly and is probably going to die off rather quickly as well as we continue watching it over the next 24 hours. Wind shear might get the better of it, dry air will get the better of it eventually, and it will probably give up sooner or later with that convection. But right now, still category 2, they'll probably downgrade to category 1 at the next advisory. Western Pacific looks like this. You can see a massive amount of cloudiness and disturbed weather all across the basin, but nothing getting organized. You can see a rotating center there not far from Ogasawara, but nothing associated with that. You've got the doldrums down in the tropical zone there, which is blowing up convection all around Micronesia, but nothing developing. Indian Ocean, you can see in the Arabian Sea there, that area of interest with some rotation starting to appear as it enters the Arabian Sea. Convection's decent, although nothing is near the center of it, if it had a center, although, well, we'll have to keep watching that, but it's a low chance. Australian region looks like this. Very little weather going on there. Frontal system blowing across the southern part of Western Australia, but generally a quiet picture. A lot of monsoonal activity just off Indonesia. So global sea surface temperatures are still fairly warm in the Eastern Pacific and picking up still in some areas, pushing 30 degrees all the way up the Gulf of California. It will favour storms that are near the coast of Mexico in the Eastern Pacific this year. The Atlantic Ocean looking very good in many areas. The Gulf Stream I'm really impressed with, extending out 26 degree waters, the same longitude as Newfoundland there, and the Gulf of Mexico 30 degrees and higher, particularly in the northern half of the region. Indian Ocean looking like this, where that area of interest is. Temperatures are good, 28 degrees, pushing 30 in one or two areas. That's not going to be its issue. Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, sorry, getting up towards 30 degrees as well. Western Pacific, very warm. We don't really need to say that every time, but it's true. And even off the coast of China, north of Shanghai there, a little pocket of 30 degrees Celsius waters. So storms in the East China Sea might have a decent time as well, at least the first ones, before any upwelling might occur. And you can see there in the East China Sea, well above average, 2 to 3 degrees above, and even further north there off Japan and up towards Russia, extremely high temperatures compared to average. In the rest of the Western Pacific, it's slightly above average, the Eastern Pacific slightly below overall, although the region that Darby developed in is slightly above right now. The Atlantic Ocean oceanic heat content rising around the Bahamas right now, but the rest is pretty much the same. Caribbean looking really hot and spicy. The Eastern Pacific picking up slowly. The Western Pacific has been looking decent the whole time and is expanding its colours there towards the north. Well then, let's take a look at the GFS model runs, and this is what it has in store for Darby. GFS actually keeping it, at least with gale force winds as it passes the Hawaiian Islands. It probably won't still be a tropical cyclone by then, it'll be a remnant low, but interesting that it could still produce gales to the big island of Hawaii possibly. Those green areas get very close to the island, so something to watch out for with a little bit of intrigue. But a tropical storm warning will probably not be required. Looking out further east in the Eastern Pacific, you can see the next system developing. It takes its time still, and we're at 90% already, but it is going to be a day or two before it starts to develop properly. We saw earlier that rotation was looking poor. Eventually it gets its act together and becomes a broad and substantial tropical cyclone that likely becomes a hurricane there. GFS calling for a Category 1 peak, possibly high end, maybe into Category 2. And this is the Indian Ocean right now. You might spot a little rotation here and there moving towards the west. There's some little bits there, and then eventually it gets eaten up by a larger low pressure system by the looks of things just off the coast of Gujarat and then along the coast of Pakistan, Karachi region, which eventually sweeps it off towards the north, maybe even towards Iran eventually. Likelihood of becoming a tropical cyclone very low, and indeed even rainfall amounts are going to remain mostly offshore, so hopefully not too much of an issue. And that's why the precipitation chart is still focusing on Hawaii, where you can see what happens with Darby, delivering only modest amounts of rainfall as we've been talking about in previous updates. We're still expecting along the coast of the Big Island around 1 inch of rainfall. That's 50, not even that, 25 millimeters. And along some of the other islands, we're looking at around ½ an inch up to 1 inch in some areas along those islands. You can see Honolulu there at 0.3 inches, so not much of a rainmaker from this tropical cyclone, or X as it will be by the time it gets there in all likelihood. Let's look into the longer range, the moderate range, from day 5 to day 10, and this is what happens with that second storm, the current 90%, becoming a hurricane, then weakening as it moves off towards the west-northwest. Then another storm forms to the southeast there and becomes possibly another hurricane, so that's interesting to see. And you'll note 1 or 2 other areas of interest that develop as well, one to the southwest of that second area of interest and one well to its east. So you'll be able to see that there as well, and we'll pick up that in a moment. That's the serious stuff done though. You can check out Force 13's Much store in the meantime, which is interesting because the QR code has been replaced by a random image of Darby, which is very odd. And you can check out our Still Waiting for Hone range. The link is in our description. And on the Scilly range, you can take a look at what happens next in the Eastern Pacific. The remnants of that next storm eventually go through Hawaii, then 3 new storms form behind it, one of them becoming a major hurricane. This is well far out in terms of the model runs, but you never know. It is late July. This kind of thing is very plausible in the Eastern Pacific, which is generally in its prime at this time of year, and can get 3 storms active at once, 2 hurricanes there at once as well. So that's a little bit out there, but you can't be too sure. Well, on this day, a completely different situation was transpiring in 1989. Hurricane Delilia, before they got the name right, was out in the Eastern Pacific with 7E forming behind it, but Typhoon Gordon was peaking as a ferocious Category 5 there on approach to Luzon, with a new tropical depression behind it, 9W, and even the southern hemisphere was joining in. Tropical Storm 2S had just formed not far from, I think, the Cocos Islands of Australia, well out to sea in the Indian Ocean, although the Atlantic was missing out that year as well. Back to this year then, and the next name on the Atlantic naming list then is Danielle. In the Eastern Pacific, it's Estelle. And in the Central Pacific, we are still waiting for Hone. The 1000 day celebrations continue, especially with that t-shirt. In the Western Pacific, the next name on the list now is Songda, and in the North Indian Ocean, we'll be looking out for Sitrang, although it's doubtful it will come from that current system. 35 storms have formed so far this year, which means there's still around 2/3 of the way to go before we get our final total. In the Australian region, the next name is Darby, Southwest Indian Ocean's Ashley, and in the South Pacific, the next name will be Harley. We'll be back again with another tropical weather bulletin tomorrow night.